All right. So we're back and we're going to go dive back into chapter 11. We may be watching a couple of videos, and then if we're finished with 11, we'll start 12. Let's see. Let me get that open too, just in case we need it. Okay, so as of right now, we're going to just carry on with 11. Now, 11, of course, is our discussion about money and the Federal Reserve System. Chapter 12 is, oh, I'm not good with abbreviations. Um, yeah, I need the actual words, but all right, so that's okay. So yeah, let's get back to this. So we've already started talking about, I think we already did start to discuss M1 and M2 last time. And so the money supply basically represents, depending on how we define money, the amount of money that's in circulation. And so M1 is the most liquid definition of money. It consists of four items, but the ones that are most important are currency in circulation plus checking deposits. These last two items are very, very small percentages of the total. We don't really need to worry about them right now. Try to think of M1 basically as currency in circulation plus how much money are people holding in their checking accounts. The reason why it's defined this way is because, in principle, you can spend currency anywhere and checking deposits almost anywhere. In other words, if you bring your checkbook with you, there's very few places where you can't actually spend a check. I'm not saying there aren't any, but there aren't that many. So if you count those as money, you have an extremely liquid definition of money. And the idea, of course, is that it can be easily used to buy goods and services. The Fed also defines M2, which is a much broader measure of money, but it also includes some assets that are not quite so liquid. For example, savings deposits are not as liquid as checking because with savings deposits, you can't directly spend them. You have to go to the bank, withdraw the money, and then use it to buy things that you want. Um, Time deposits represent savings deposits where you have to keep the money there for a fixed length of time. So small time deposits, we count that as part of M2. Money market deposit accounts, these are basically checking accounts written on a fund of short-term liquid securities where there are limitations on how many checks you can write every month, but you get a higher rate of return than you would get from a traditional checking account. So those are out there too. But again, they're not quite as liquid as a regular checking account. So M2 is a broader measure of money than M1. M1 is a more liquid measure than M2. So for the most part, when we talk about money in this course, we'll be thinking about M1. We also have something called the monetary base, which proves to be very important, as we'll see later on, because the Federal Reserve System directly controls the size of the monetary base. It only has indirect control over the size of the money supply, as we'll see later on. So the monetary base consists of two key components, which we'll explain as we go along. Currency in circulation, which we already know what that is. This is what we need to explain total reserves in the banking system. Basically, what happens is the Federal Reserve requires the banks to set aside some of their checking or other deposits into a special account with the Fed, which is called a reserve account. The money sits there and it cannot be lent out to customers. The purpose of having it there is to preserve the safety of the banking system. We do not want a situation where people ask for their money back from the banks and the banks don't have it. Why is this a problem? Because the banks, as you know, lend out just about all of the deposits that come into the bank. So you may have a checking account in the bank, or a savings account, but if you're like most people, most of the funds in your account have been lent out to another customer without your being aware of it. And so at any given time, if you came to the bank and said, please, I want my money back, they have to be in a position to give it to you. They can't just say, no, it's not here. It's been lent out to our other customers. So some money has to be available to satisfy withdrawals from customers. The Fed sets a number, a target, which the banks are required to follow. And that money is set aside, like I said, in an account with the Fed. And that is sitting there just in case the customers need their money back. So the percentage that the banks have to hold depends on the size of the bank. The smaller banks have very small reserve requirements. The larger banks have much larger ones because obviously it's riskier to allow a large bank to run out of money than a small bank. Anyway, so we'll see as we go along why this monetary base is so important. But just keep in mind, the Federal Reserve directly controls the size of both of these components, whereas its control of the money supply is only indirect. But anyway, so the Federal Reserve System, which I believe we started to go over, is the central bank of the United States. And there had been two previous attempts at having a central bank in the United States, which you can see their names there are the First and Second Bank of the United States. And by the way, if you're ever in Philadelphia, the First Bank of the United States, the building that they operated in is still there, except that it's been converted into an art gallery where they have art from the artists of the time. For example, Rembrandt Peale and people like that. A lot of their art is kept in the First Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States is still there too, but I don't know if they've reopened it yet. They had to do a lot of major renovations on it. I am not quite sure what their plans are for the Second Bank, but in fact, these buildings are quite spectacular examples of colonial architecture. In fact, why don't we quickly take a look and you'll see what I mean. Here's, let's see, the First Bank. It basically looks like a Greek temple, doesn't it? It has those wonderful columns in the front. This is the First Bank of the United States. And it's still sitting there, right where they built it in the early, actually the late 18th century. And so, like I said, you can go in there now and visit it, but don't expect to see any banking going on. It is just an art gallery now. The Second Bank does look like a Greek temple. Let's see if we can find it. As far as I know, the last time I checked, it was still not open yet. There it is. I mean, you'd think you were in Athens when you're looking at that, wouldn't you? It looks just like a Greek temple, and it was meant to be impressive. That's why it looks like that. Okay, it's the second central bank. Now, let's just see. Oh my God, it looks like they did manage to get it back open again. It's another portrait gallery. I like that. Okay, well, there you go. The last time I was in Philadelphia, they're still working on it. They had a lot of construction to do. Well, it appears that the construction is over because, oh my God, look at that. Well, so if you've got nothing better to do this Christmas, this summer vacation, what the heck? Why not take a little stroll down to Philadelphia? Yeah, so these, oh my God. Yeah, Philadelphia is at least the historic district of Philadelphia is extremely impressive. Oh, yes, it is. All right, well, anyway, enough of that fun stuff. So then, what is the job of the Fed? Well, first of all, they regulate the banking system. They act as a lender of last resort. Banks who are in trouble can borrow from the Fed. They issue currency. Of course, all the paper money in your pocket was issued by one of the district Federal Reserve banks. And they conduct monetary policy, which is actually their most important job. And we'll talk about that further as we go along. The map, as you can see, breaks it up. There's 12 districts. I think last time I gave you that trivia question about which state has two Federal Reserve district banks. Do you remember that? What did the answer turn out to be?
St. Louis, Missouri.
Yes, Missouri has both the Kansas City branch and the St. Louis branch. This is Kansas City, Missouri, not Kansas City, Kansas. So it just so happens that, well, it just sort of worked out that way, that one state has two. But you can see some of these other districts are quite large, like San Francisco. But I did mention that that's because at the time that the Fed was created, the population on the West Coast was very small compared to today. Otherwise, there might be a separate district just for California, for example, and one for all these other states. The Dallas district is pretty much Texas plus parts of Louisiana and New Mexico. Minneapolis covers all these northern cold states. We have Chicago over here, Cleveland, and over here we have Boston, of course, has all of New England. New York is basically just New York. And Jersey, yes, it includes Jersey. Philadelphia is just Pennsylvania. And Richmond includes Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and North and South Carolina. And finally, we have Atlanta, which has basically all the southern states, including Florida. Actually, I think New York also includes the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. I'd have to double check that. The Board of Governors, though, is located in Washington. They basically oversee the entire system. So there's 7 members. There's a chairman. Now, by the way, when you hear in the media, the chairman of the Fed, who, by the way, at the moment is Jerome Powell. He's been in office for about 4 years now, 3 years. And he's actually the chairman of the Board of Governors. But in the press, they tend to say that he's the chairman of the Fed. He's actually the chairman of the Board of Governors. There's also a vice chairman. There's altogether 7 members. These guys are appointed by the president. They get a 14-year term. That's a long time. Why? Because the hope is that they will be insulated from political pressures. In fact, the whole point of the way the Fed was set up was to keep it independent of the government so that they will do what they think is right without worrying about politics. And to a large degree, that's exactly what's happened. The Fed, interestingly enough, but just by the way it's been set up, is independent, but also they do not need a budget from Congress. They have their own money. It's a profit-making, where it is profitable. It's not meant to be a profit-making institution, but they do make profits anyway. So much so that they don't need any money from Congress, which makes them even that much more insulated from Congress. Congress can't say to them, well, if you don't do what we want, we'll cut you off. Well, there's nothing to cut off. They have their own money. The chairman and the vice chairman usually get a 4-year term, which can be renewed. If not, they typically step down rather than being demoted to just a regular governor. So the Board of Governors does two or three things. They set the required reserve ratio, which means the percentage that the banks have to set aside in the form of reserves. And they also set the discount rate, which is the rate that they charge banks for loans. Okay, remember, the banks who are in trouble can always go to the Fed for money if they're really desperate. That's why they're there. The Fed doesn't want banks to fail. They want to keep them going if possible, and they'll do that by lending them money when they're in trouble. Now, that doesn't mean that the banks can be reckless and then they'll be bailed out by the Fed. If they come to the Fed and say, listen, we need $100 million because we gambled away all of the money, well, that's going to be a problem. I mean, they're probably going to find themselves out of a job, but it happens. Banks run into trouble through no fault of their own. Like, for example, banks in areas of the country where there's a lot of agriculture, let's say they make their money by lending to farmers, and then all of a sudden there's a drought. The farmers can't pay their loans. The bank's in trouble because the weather was bad. So when that happens, the Fed is ready to lend them more money to help them get through the crisis. And also the Board of Governors is the one that actually regulates the banking system. They choose the rules for the banking system. So what other parts of the Fed are there that really are important to us? Now, this is the one that you hear about in the press all the time. The Federal Open Market Committee. They're the ones who carry out monetary policy. Now, in a nutshell, monetary policy means changing the level of the money supply to affect interest rates, which in turn will impact on the entire economy, of course. So it's the Federal Open Market Committee who ultimately decides what interest rates will look like in the United States. Okay, so we'll get into that in more detail as we go along, but these are the guys who are really, some would say they have the most power in the Federal Reserve System because they're the ones who are carrying out the monetary policy. Now, this committee has 12 voting members, all 7 members of the governors, the Board of Governors, and 5 of the 12 Federal Reserve District Bank presidents. Those rotate, but the New York Fed president is always a voting member of the FOMC. Why the New York Fed? Why are they so special? Why is their president always on this committee? What would be the reason behind that? What's in New York City? Besides subways, what's in New York City?
Financial markets.
Financial markets, yes, the stock exchange, all the financial districts. It's the financial capital of the United States. So when the Fed engages in monetary policy, they're actually interacting with the financial markets. Often they're buying or selling bonds or sometimes foreign exchange. And so because they're right in the financial district, they can carry out those orders right then and there from the New York Fed. In fact, they have traders at the New York Fed that deal directly with the financial markets. If they need to buy bonds or sell bonds, that's who they call. The Fed calls up Wall Street and says, listen, we need to do the following things. And so it's convenient to have one in the New York City area. And so therefore, it makes sense that they would always be part of this committee. Now, Cleveland and Chicago take turns with each other. The rest of them just rotate out from this committee. Now, by the way, all of them attend the meetings. It's just that only 12 of them are allowed to vote. They all have to be there because all the information that's discussed, this is where they sit down and they decide among themselves what's going on in the economy. And they're saying, listen, and each president can step up and say, here's what's going on in my district. Because, obviously it's tough to keep track of what's going on in the entire country. So each Federal Reserve president can keep track and explain to them what's happening in their districts so they can make decisions about monetary policy. Now, if you're interested, every time they have a meeting, when they're done, they issue a document called a beige book. And the beige book contains their analysis of what's going on in the economy. Okay, in fact, it's right here. If you wanted to read the January 13th beige book, it's right here. Look at that. And it's free. And all it is they go through and they say, listen, what's going on in the economy? And then they break it down by the districts, which range from Boston to San Francisco. And if you look at it and say, listen, I want to know what's going on in my district, well, there it is. Okay, well, this is just a brief highlight, but they also will get into much more detailed activity here. And they'll explain to you what they think is happening in the economy and why they took the actions that they did at the most recent meetings. Okay. So there's a lot of detail here, but it's all right there at your fingertips if you want it. In fact, by the way, if you're looking for important information about economics, not just data like you get at Fred, but documents about different aspects of the economy, the Federal Reserve System has an enormous amount of free research that you can get just by going to their different websites. And most of it is intended for non-specialists. In other words, people who are simply interested in knowing more about the economy. You can go to these different Federal Reserve banks and say, all right, what kind of wonderful research publications do you have for me? So let's try the Federal Reserve Bank of New York publications, not working papers. Those are very specialized. Let's try publications. Let's see what they've got for us. Markets and policy implementation. Wow, look at all this stuff they have. Markets data dashboard. Ooh, look at all this fun stuff they have for us. Man, I'm going to keep this up here so we'll know what's going on later on when we start talking about monetary policy. Now, by the way, these are their holdings. The Fed owns a large quantity of Treasury securities. In fact, let's see. That's in thousands. So this is $7.2 trillion. So in addition to earning profits every year, they have $7.2 trillion worth of treasury securities that they own and they could sell if they needed to. So like I said, the Congress can't tell them what to do. They have plenty of their own money. Oh my God, this is really interesting. Now, of course, I showed you before already the money museums that are available for you at the San Francisco Fed and the Philadelphia Fed, and I think Chicago's has one too. And so all this great information and economic research. What if you want to read articles about, how COVID-19 affected first-time homebuyers, or, well, some of these you may not be interested in. Do people view housing as a good investment and why? There's all kinds of wonderful stuff in here. So if you found yourself needing to write a paper for another class, this would be a great source because it's all free. They have everything. And this is just the New York Fed. You can also go find research at like the Atlanta Fed has a lot of great papers, and the St. Louis Fed has Fred. Oh, no, you know what I just remembered? Yes, I'm glad you asked me. It took me a while to get it posted. So I think you can have, wait a minute, am I thinking of the wrong class? Did I just?
You mentioned before. You mentioned when last class when I talked to you about it, you said it's due next Monday.
That's right. Yes, I decided to let you have until next Monday. Which, by the way, we're off next Monday. Monday the 3rd is a holiday for us, so try to have it by Monday, the midnight of Monday the 3rd of May. Okay. I think what happened was I got delayed posting it or something. So Monday the 3rd is quite sufficient for that one. All right. So you have plenty of time, not to mention you have all day Monday off because the school is closed that day. I wouldn't wait till Monday to do it, but just that should take care of it. All right. Anyway, so here's what you can get for the Fed. Now, what does the Fed do? The Federal Open Market Committee meets 8 times a year, basically every 6 weeks. They set the target. Now, we haven't discussed this yet, but the federal funds rate is one of their primary tools of monetary policy. Basically, in a nutshell, the banks, because they have these reserve requirements, sometimes they run short of their targets. Let's say, for example, they're expecting somebody to pay back their loan on Monday and it didn't happen. All of a sudden, that bank is short of their target for that day. They could be fined by the Fed if that happens. So what do they do? Well, they have one option. Suppose, for example, that the bank needs to borrow $100,000, but just for one night. Okay, because the next day they expect to have plenty of money to cover the reserve requirements. So what do? They go to another bank that has excess funds to lend out, and they set up a loan that lasts literally overnight. The rate of interest that they charge each other for these loans is called the federal funds rate. Or in the media, they often refer to it simply as the Fed funds rate, which at the moment is at a preposterously low level. Let's see if we can, there we go. Right now, for all practical purposes, it's 0. It's technically a range from 0 to 0.25%. That's what they call it. It's so low, but it's essentially 0, which is not normal by any means. Throughout US history, you can see this is what it used to look like. Look at some of these numbers. As recently as 20 years ago, it was 6.51%. And in the late 70s, when inflation got completely out of control, it was up well into the double digits. So, but you can see this is not normal. Back here, we had a long period of almost 0 rates because of the housing crisis. Now, all of a sudden, we have a COVID crisis. You never know. I mean, crises are just waiting around the next corner. No matter what you do, sooner or later, there's going to be another crisis. But we hope to keep them as far apart as we can. So the Fed funds rate at the moment is essentially zero, or it's very, very close to it. But that's because of the COVID. It normally would be higher than that. Like even as recently, look at this. 2 years ago, it got as high as 2.44%. And then all of a sudden, pow, look what happened right there. That's around when we had to stop going to school in person. So anyway, that's the federal funds rate. Now the Fed doesn't actually directly control that rate. What they do is they set a target for it. The target means this is the rate we want it to stay in to be consistent with our policy objectives. And if it starts to drift outside that range, then they have to take steps to put it, basically nudge it back into that range. And that's coming from these so-called open market operations, where basically what they're doing is they're either buying bonds from the banking system or selling bonds to the banking system in order to nudge the federal funds rate back to its target level. They also have the ability to intervene in foreign exchange markets. They can buy and sell foreign currencies if they need to in order to achieve certain objectives. Like, for example, if the dollar is suddenly dropping like crazy in value, they can step in and take steps to prevent the dollar from falling further. Or maybe it's going the other way. What if the dollar's getting too strong? They can do just the opposite if they need to. All right, so the Fed has that ability as well. So they get together 8 times a year, and it's a big deal. There's a lot of publicity surrounding each of these meetings. And so what they do is when the meetings are over, they issue a statement in which they explain what they've done and why. And here at these meetings, typically either they raise the Fed funds target, they lower it, or they leave it where it is. And so while they're meeting, all of Wall Street holds its breath to see what they're going to do, because it has a major impact on the markets, as you can imagine. They also read carefully the statements that come out afterwards to try to anticipate where they're going next. Okay, so in other words, and the Fed tries to leave things a little on the vague side. They don't want Wall Street to know too much about their intentions. They want to leave it sort of in general terms, but there are a lot of people whose jobs on Wall Street is to focus their attention on what they think the Fed's going to do. Anyway, so then we're now ready to discuss what's called monetary policy, which means we're regulating economic activity through the creation of or the control of credit and money. This is the Fed's responsibility. Okay, now there's 2 basic kinds of monetary policy. We have expansionary, which means we're trying to stimulate the economy. This is going to happen whenever the economy is slowing down. They do not want the unemployment rate to get too high. So if the economy is slowing down, what the Fed is basically going to do is 2 things: increase the money supply. Well, actually, one thing, they're going to increase the money supply because that will tend to have the effect of lowering interest rates. And of course, when interest rates go down, 2 things typically happen. Number 1, consumers buy more things on credit. And number 2, businesses invest more. So lower interest rates are very, very stimulative to the economy. Okay, most of that's coming from, like I said, consumers and businesses. Consumers will tend to buy more new cars and more new houses, etc., when rates are low. And businesses are more likely to expand their operations or build new inventories when interest rates are low. Well, then why would the Fed ever want to do the opposite? The opposite of this is contractionary monetary policy. And this means the Fed wants to slow the economy down by doing the opposite, by lowering the money supply so that interest rates go up. Why would they do that? Because they're worried about inflation. Inflation, yes. Now, it doesn't, I haven't said it so yet, but The number one priority of the Fed is to keep inflation under control. All the rest is secondary to that goal, keeping inflation under control. And their goal is typically to keep it from getting above 2%. They don't want it to get any higher than that because then it starts to expand. The thing about inflation, it's kind of like almost like a rock rolling down a hill. Once it starts to get some momentum going, it's going to be next to impossible to stop it. So with inflation, the Fed's job is to keep it from getting out of hand, from getting it too fast or growing too fast, because they know how hard it will be to stop it once it starts expanding. Expansion, I would say so. Yeah, I'd say throughout the last 40, 50 years, most of the time when the economy needed help, it was because it was too slow rather than too fast. So most of the time, I'd say they're carrying out expansionary monetary policy. Our inflation rate has been so low for so long that contractionary hasn't really been that important in recent years. I mean, they do use it once in a while, but it's been far more often expansionary policy to overcome recessions and crises and all the rest. So I would agree with that. Now, the other thing they have to watch out for is that when the Fed takes an action, it can take a while before it has an impact on the economy. In fact, I was actually once on a tour at the Fed, which you're allowed to go on, by the way. Schools can make arrangements to have tours of the New York Fed. So I was lucky enough to get on one a few years ago, and they told us that conducting monetary policy is in a lot of ways like steering a super tanker. Imagine yourself on this enormous super tanker going down the Mississippi River, heading out to the ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, I guess. They said that on a super tanker, if you decide that it's time to turn the wheel, the ship will actually react to that 1 mile down the river. So in other words, you have to turn the ship a mile ahead of time, otherwise you'll miss your turn. And they said monetary policy is a lot of ways, just like captaining the super tanker, in order to wring inflation out of the economy, you have to start fighting it essentially a year in advance before it actually gets going, because it takes so long for changes in interest rates to have that kind of an impact on inflation that they really have to be looking at least a year ahead when they decide what to do about inflation. So it's a tough job. They've done a pretty good job of it in the recent years, but and the inflation rate hasn't been above 2% in quite a long time. So they've succeeded at least in that way. But it is tricky business, and so they have to be very careful about what they do because it takes so long in some cases for their actions to have an impact. But I always remember that metaphor about the super tanker on the Mississippi River. That's what their job is like. Okay. Or it's like a cruise ship. Sometimes they have to go through these very narrow channels, and so it's a tough job. Captaining a cruise ship. It sounds like it's a lot of fun, but it's really a lot of work because they're often taking these enormous ships through these very small areas. And so they really have to watch what they're doing. But anyway, so how does the Fed carry out monetary policy? Well, there's 4 basic instruments, of which the first one is by miles the most important one: open market operations. We also have the discount rate, which we've already seen is used to determine how much the banks pay for loans. The required reserve ratio, which is designed to tell us what percentage of a bank's deposits have to be set aside in reserve accounts. And the last one can include a lot of things that are normally only used during a genuine crisis, like COVID or the housing crisis. So let's go through these one at a time. Now, the open market operations I mentioned earlier basically are purchases or sales of bonds. And in fact, by the way, that's why the Fed has this huge portfolio of treasuries, which unfortunately, I think I've lost that page. Oh, it was right there in my finger. Here we go. There's a reason why they have all these bonds in their portfolio, because they use them for open market operations. But they don't need this much. typically. I mean, a lot of this is there because these are past profits, and they typically try to avoid investing in stocks. Because they're worried about affecting the stock market. This is different. They're basically lending money to the federal government when they buy these treasury securities. And so that's why they do this. But anyway, so how does this work? So we either buy or sell securities from either government bond dealers or banks. Okay, bond dealers obviously specialize in bonds, and banks, we know what they do. They borrow and lend money to make profits. So these would be large commercial banks, by the way. The Fed isn't going to be buying and selling bonds to small savings banks. This would typically be large commercial banks like Chase. Now, as we said before, the federal funds rate, this is the rate at which the banks borrow and lend among themselves. Typically, they do this because they're short on their reserves targets. I mean, there could be other reasons too, but if they're borrowing and lending directly to each other, this is referred to as the federal funds rate. And these are typically very, very short-term loans. Usually they don't go out more than a week or so. They're often overnight, but they could go out just maybe a week because they're meant for very short-term purposes. In other words, this is not where they get money. Let's say the bank needs to fix their roof. This is not where they get the money from. For that, they might go to another bank. I mean, outside of this market. So the reserves are bank deposits held by the Fed. Also currency, if the bank has any actual currency, which most banks don't have a lot of currency anymore, that counts as a reserve, by the way. But most banks, let's face it, if you go to a vault in a bank now, it's not going to have a whole lot of money. In fact, sometimes in the news, you hear about these stories where somebody will rob a bank thinking they're going to get lots and lots of money. And it turns out the whole bank only has $3,000 in it. No, they just don't hold a lot of currency anymore. The Fed requires the banks to hold a specified percentage of their checking deposits in the form of reserves in order to ensure the safety of the banking system. The Fed controls the federal rates only indirectly. What they're setting is not the rate itself. It sets a target. Now, the banks can charge whatever they want for these federal funds, but they're usually charging roughly the same amount for each other. The Fed can only set a target. Okay, so when the Fed engages in open market operations, they're affecting directly the quantity of reserves in the banking system, which in turn affects their lending activity. That in turn affects the size of the money supply, and that in turn affects interest rates. All right, so this is sort of, you can see there's a cause and effect chain going on here. The Fed engages in open market operations, the quantity of reserves changes, the size of the money supply changes depending on how much of these reserves the banks lend out. And then the size of the money supply change influences how much interest rates will change. And we know that interest rates affect the spending, the pattern of borrowing and spending among consumers and businesses. And those two represent about 75% of GDP. So this is likely to have a major impact. By the way, I think I'd like to introduce one little detail here, just as a quick summary of what these open market operations are actually doing. If bank reserves increase, okay, bank loans increase, the money supply increases. We'll see why in a little while. Interest rates fall, and then economic activity increases. Okay, so this is the chain of events that happens when there's an open market operation, typically. So the Fed is increasing the bank's reserves with an open market operation. And of course, if the opposite happens, Well, obviously we have to reverse all of this. If the bank reserves decrease, bank loans decrease, they have less money to lend out, the money supply decreases, interest rates rise, and economic activity decreases. Okay, so this is, and the Fed knows this. Now, the Fed does not ultimately control, like I said, any of this directly. All they can do is add or subtract reserves from the banking system and sit back and watch the rest of this happen. Sometimes the impact is stronger than other times. It depends on what's going on in the economy. During a crisis, often this chain starts to slow down and weaken, and that can be a real problem. All right, but anyway, so open market operations can be carried out quickly and easily as the need arises. So therefore, this would be considered the most effective and the most widely used instrument of monetary policy. Okay, this is the one they lean on the most often. In fact, these operations could literally take place every single day. And that's why, like we said before, why it's so helpful to have the New York Fed be the one that carries out these operations, because that's where the financial markets are. The discount rate is the rate charged by the Fed for loans to the banks. This they do control. And let's see, let me look it up if I can, what the current discount rate is. It's usually said to be a certain percentage above the Fed funds rate. All right, right now it is, oh, maybe it's in this meeting. Oh boy. Oh my God. Well, it's a formula. It's the average of the daily effective federal funds rate and the rate on 3-month CDs over the past 14 days. Well, all right, all that means is that it's higher than the federal funds rate. It used to be a constant amount. They used to just say it's 3% or 4%. Now I guess it changes. They're allowing it to fluctuate. It's reset, it looks like every 2 weeks. Huh, boy, they've really complicated it, haven't they? Man. All right. And then, of course, the required reserve ratio. This means all of the reserves, the funds that they set aside, and it can be held as in the form of vol cash, although there's very little of that. And then deposits at the Fed, which are known as reserves. Now, by the way, the bank does pay a small amount of interest on these deposits or reserves, but it's really small. The banks would rather lend out the money, but they can't. Okay, 10.1%. Oh my God. Boy, you can see why the banks would rather lend that money out. 0.1%. What is that going to get them? Well, well, well. It's better than nothing, right? In fact, it used to be nothing. Up until about 15 years ago, they did not get any interest at all on these deposits. So the amount that they're required to hold are called required reserves. They're intended to reserve the safety of the banking system, of course. If they choose to hold more, which they probably won't, they would be referred to as excess reserves. And sometimes you see in some books, the total required and excess reserves is known as desired reserves, because presumably the banks hold that by their choice. I prefer to think about it as required and excess reserves. But now here's the thing though, banks that do hold excess reserves can lend them out to other banks in the federal funds market. So that's what that's all about. the banks that have excess reserves that are earning a pitiful rate of interest can increase their rate of return by lending them to other banks, even if it's only for one night. That's still more money, especially because the amounts involved are usually fairly large. We're not talking about $50 here. You know, these are almost certainly loans of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars. So even one night can bring them a lot of interest. Now, this is how it had previously worked. The small banks, which hold anywhere from no money to $15.2 million in transactions deposits, they're called, or checking deposits, did not have to hold any reserves at all. If the bank's holdings were from 15.2 to $110.2 million, they had to hold 3% in the form of reserves. And then the really large banks that held more than $110.2 million in reserves, or deposits rather, all the way up to 10%. Now, these rates are almost never changed. The key word there being almost, because it turns out, we'll go see an article about this on the internet. The Fed, because of the COVID crisis, although they'll change this again pretty soon, they lowered those required reserve ratios to 0 for everybody. Okay. 0. All right. Well, we don't want to have to read this whole article, but just because of the COVID, so just while the COVID is going on, these are all 0 now. But I'm sure they'll go back as soon as the COVID is over. In fact, that probably would fall into one of these categories: extraordinary crisis measures. Every so often we run into a financial crisis, like the credit crisis of 2008 through 9, during which time several financial institutions failed. That was when housing prices collapsed, and a lot of banks failed as a result. And in fact, if you're interested in this period in history, there's a movie you can watch where they did an excellent job. In fact, I'll just write it in the chat room. Suppose you like to learn more about finance by watching movies. The name of this movie, when you may have heard of it, it's all about the housing crisis in 2008 through 9 and the financial crisis that resulted from it. In fact, that's when Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns went out of business because of this crisis. So the Fed, being confronted with this unusual crisis, recognizing that the potential for catastrophe was very high, jumped in and decided to buy a lot of these really risky assets that the banks had acquired during the crisis. In other words, a lot of these so-called credit derivatives, whose values depended on the housing market staying strong, they lost tons of money. And so, in fact, the Fed had to bail out a lot of these banks by buying up their inventory of credit derivatives and other crappy assets to make sure they didn't fail. Because otherwise, we could have had worse than the Depression if they hadn't acted. But they did, and they refer to this as quantitative easing. The Fed purchased non-performing assets from the banking system in order to ensure that they had enough liquidity to carry out their normal operations. Non-performing is just a nice name for crap, okay? Assets that were worth nothing. But, they had previously been worth a lot, but they've lost all their value because of the crisis. Anyway, so this is something you hopefully they don't have to do very often. But anyway, so just to summarize, the open market operations are the most often used, most flexible, and most effective tools of monetary policy. Discount loans are used less frequently. They have a smaller impact on the economy, but it's important that they're there so the banks know not to panic if they have a problem. They can always come to the Fed and have them help out with loans. Changes in the required reserve ratio could work very effectively, but they don't happen very often because that would be very disruptive to the banking system, because all their long-range planning is based on these required reserve ratios. And if they're suddenly changed, that could throw them all, well, let's just say that could be a problem. It would be like, imagine if you were saving for your retirement, and then one day the government says, you know what, from now on, you have to be 90 to retire. Well, what would that do to your planning? Imagine if you're 60 and you suddenly find out, oh no, I've got to wait another 30 years to retire. It would be something, maybe not quite that serious, but something that would be very disruptive. And they're only used very occasionally. Now, the Fed has other duties as well. You wouldn't think so. I mean, well, we know that they regulate the banking system, but they clear checks, among other things. Now, of course, at this point in time, the use of checks is much lower because of all the technology, but they still exist. And how does the Fed, I mean, when you think about it, when you write a check, how does the money get from your bank to the other bank or vice versa? It has to go through a clearing system, which is run by the Fed. Okay, the computers from the banks and the Fed have to communicate with each other to make sure the money gets where it's going. And of course, we've already seen that they provide currency, specifically notes, to the banking system. All right, the coins are the responsibility of the Treasury Department, who issues them through the U.S. mints. I don't know how that happened, why there's two separate, why coins are responsible, the responsibility of one branch of government and the notes are from the Fed, but that's just the way it worked out. It acts as the lender of last resort. It can intervene in the foreign exchange markets to stabilize the value of the dollar as needed. And finally, oh, that was it. Okay. Now, the next section we're about to look at explains the relationship between the total reserves in the banking system and the money supply. But before we look at this, because it's fairly involved, I have one or two fun videos for us to watch. All right. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Noah.
For chapter 9 on the PowerPoint, I couldn't find, you didn't post the one with notes. Would you be able to post that soon?
Oh, did I really forget to do that?
Yeah, there's no notes for chapter 9, and I kind of need that.
Oh, I am so glad you told me, because
So when you have time.
I must have just forgotten. Let me.
Thank you.
Oh, there it is. Ooh, did I really miss that? I'm very disappointed in myself. I'm usually pretty good, but I guess that was an unusually busy day. You know what? I'm going to do it right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you for telling me, because I really didn't know. I kind of blew it.
I think you got all the other ones, though.
Good. Okay, good. You let me know if you find another one, though. Yeah. Oh, no, not that one. My Moodle. All right.
I don't see any for chapter 11 or 12.
Oh, that's because we're not
10.
done with them. Yeah, I'll take care of that. Those aren't done. That's why. But this one is
Or
done.
chapter 10.
Yeah. Oh, really? No, there it is. Oh, well, all right. I'll check in on that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. But this one I definitely want to do right now before I forget, because that was a big deal. That's where half the fun is, in those handwritten notes, isn't it? That's one thing I'm going to miss when we go back to normal, which apparently is going to happen soon. Where is it? Yeah, I like writing on this little thing. There it is. All right, so they're together now. All right, good. All right, anyway, so yes, we have a couple of fun videos here. We can't have a class without fun videos. No, that's not right. But yes, videos are very helpful. And let's see, what do we have coming up for us? So we got some more discussion about paper money, which you'll enjoy very much. And there's one about coins, which you'll like. Oh, the Fed is way down here, but that's all right. I'm sure you will like these videos very much, even though some of these really should have been shown a little sooner because they involve paper money, but that's okay. They're all worth watching. All right, let's check out this first one. This is more specifically about American paper money. This series we watched before was about all paper money. This is only about the United States. All right, let's check this out. Okay, I have to stop sharing and then let's check it out.
Goods in Virginia in gold or silver, meaning you would be incentivized to buy those. Continental dollar. In 1778, the war turned back into America's favor when longtime British friends. The paper money supply formed, called the Greenback Party. This party even got 10% of the votes in the 8th election.
Wow, that was pretty intensive, wasn't it? All right, so I've got two more here that we should watch. These are both more fun than serious. So these are more about the banknotes themselves, and I think we've already seen some videos by the same person who creates these. So there's at least two that we want to look at, just because they're fun. Like I said, not quite so serious. So this for next one is called the world's coolest banknotes. All right, let's check this out.
Fifth place is the ultra modern Norwegian crown. Although the new series share their size, colour, and featured person with the old, the new feature a top to bottom transfer.
All right, I think you'll agree that was a lot of fun. There's one more, just one more. That's it, and then we'll be done. This one is well worth waiting for. Hold on one second. So you'll be surprised by this one. All right, check this out.
This video is sponsored by Change Checker. However, this is actually running some
All right. Well, that one was kind of just for the fun of it, obviously. But the one about the history of American currency, I thought that was extremely interesting, especially because they went out of their way to mention at the end what it was that really led to the creation of the Fed. It was the Panic of 1907, in which it became crystal clear that we need to have a central bank in case something like that happens again. And so, I mean, there was just no central bank for the 75 years. And so that's really what ultimately triggered the creation of the Fed. So anyway, in the meantime, when we get back on Thursday, we'll wrap up 11, which is almost done. And then we can dive into 12, where we look more intensively at monetary policy. All right. So other than that, I guess, and oh yeah, and those exams are due a week from Monday, from today. And also don't forget, we're off next Monday. So I'll see you on Thursday then. And
Thank
then
you, Professor.
we'll plan for the final exam then. All right. See you next time.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Bye.